Hi, and welcome to another video on the Casio CT-X3000. And in this video, I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail about a piece of music I've recorded called Snowfall, which is available on my YouTube channel if you want to take a look at that. And I'm just going to go into the process of actually making that piece of music. The original piece of music, Snowfall, I wrote for a small orchestra of instruments quite a few years ago now, but I thought it would be quite appropriate for this time of the year. Certainly in the UK, we often see a little bit of snow coming in January. So the original piece of music was written for two flutes and two clarinets, a trumpet, two trombones, a gong or cymbals, a glockenspiel, piano, and then strings of violin, first violin, second violins, violas, and cellos. And on the recording that I've made, I've only used the Casio tones and nothing else. I haven't used any other equipment. It's just the tones from the Casio that you're hearing. The only other little thing that I've done is just to add a little bit of effects to the sounds, but then I've mixed everything in the DAW. So let me go through sort of a step-by-step process. For some of you, this will be a completely new learning curve, so I want to go fairly steadily through it so that you can understand the process and then have a go at it yourself. So I suppose the first thing is to connect the keyboard up to the computer. And on the back of the keyboard, it has the USB connection. So you're going to need a USB cable to connect into the computer. One like this, which has that sort of square end on it like that. That goes into the back of the Casio, and the other end of the USB cable goes directly into your laptop or PC. So once you've connected the Casio in, you're also going to perhaps need an audio interface. So here's an example of an audio interface. This one is called the Audio Box USB 96, made by PreSonus. But it doesn't matter really which make you go for. They're all of a very good quality really these days. This one's got two inputs on the front and then various controls for controlling the level of those inputs, a headphone control and a main output control. And then round the back, again, there's another USB connection. So you're going to need the same kind of cable and another cable to connect this into your PC as well. On this box, there's also MIDI sockets, but we're not really using those. And I'm not using the main outs, just the headphone socket will be enough. So that's really the only extra bit of equipment. Often these audio devices come with some DAW software with them. And again, that's enough to really get you started. I use a program called Reason, but there are other programs. There's Logic, Cubase, Ableton, and many others, which will do a similar kind of function. So once we're connected, let's head over to the DAW and I'll show you how the music was put together. So this is the screen, one of the screens in Reason, and whichever DAW you're using, they'll pretty much have the same kind of layout. Down the left-hand side will be the tracks, one on top of the other, and then sort of in the main center of the screen will be the left to right aspect of the music, and usually bar numbers or minutes and seconds along the top, some kind of divisions. And then there'll also be a transport control with a stop and a start and a record button. And that's pretty much the kind of standard layout. Let's have a listen to an example of the recording that I made. So I'm just going to press play. Okay, so there's a short extract from Snowfall. So let's just take a little look at setting up the DAW. It'll, as I said, it'll vary according to which software you're using, and yet in other ways it'll be pretty much the same. In Reason, there's a Preferences tab that we can go to and set up the audio. So I'm actually using a different audio box to the one I showed you at the beginning of the video. I'm using a Roland audio box, card driver it's called here. I've set that up. And then under control surfaces, it doesn't have in Reason the Casio, so I'm just using a sort of generic controller surface, which is basically what the keyboard is doing. It's just providing pretty much note information into the software. So once you've set that all up, you're pretty much good to go. There's one other thing to do on the keyboard itself, and that is to make sure that you've turned MIDI local control to off. So on the keyboard, you need to press Function and then use your left and right arrows until you find MIDI, press Enter, and again scroll. There are only two parameters here. One of those says local, and make sure that it says off. What this does is it kind of disconnects the keyboard from the sounds within the instrument. So the physical keyboard is cut off, and what's going to happen is that the MIDI information is going to go out of the keyboard into the computer and be recorded, and then come all the way back and then trigger the sounds. So although when I press a key, you're hearing the flute sound in this example, the note data is going out and then back in again. If we don't turn this local control to off, what happens is that it generates a loop and it just goes round and round, and you get this kind of weird phasing effect on the tone. So make sure that you turn local off on the keyboard itself. The other thing that I've done is I've set up through the software program changes so that when I go from one track to another, we've got a flute voice here, or flute tone. If I go to the clarinet, we've now got the clarinet tone. You can do that within the DAW. You can set up program changes. I've found that the Casio doesn't always respond to them, so sometimes I have to actually sort of go and resend the message again. So in Reason, we have this sequencer page that you can see, I hope, on the screen at the moment. There's also a rack. This is a virtual rack of instruments and effects. And I've set up MIDI devices, MIDI out devices, which allow me to do this recording of the MIDI data into the program, into the DAW, and then back out again. Normally, I suppose, really, I'd be using virtual instruments and synthesizers and drum machines that are built into the software, but I wanted to demonstrate the kind of quality of the tone of the Casio. So that's why I've set up these MIDI out devices. In the MIDI out device on Reason, you've got a little program number that you can change. Let me just go back to the sequencer page so that I'm on the flute tone. And then we'll go back to the rack. So this is the rack that is controlling the flute tone. And if I change the program number here, you can hear the tones changing on the Casio without me having to do anything on the keyboard. These numbers are the general MIDI numbers. General MIDI is a list of 128 tones, always in a certain prescribed order. And number 74 happens to be the flute tone. So for each of the tracks that I've created, they all have a different MIDI program number. So if I go down to the trumpet tone down here, this is 57. And trombones are 58. Piano is number 1. Drums tend to always be on a MIDI channel, number 10. So actually, maybe I should just talk about that a little bit. Each of these tones are on different MIDI channels. So as well as a program number, there's a MIDI channel. So the first flute I've put on MIDI channel 1, the second flute I put on MIDI channel 2, first clarinet on MIDI channel 3, and so on through the setting up of the song. When we come to drums and percussion tones, the standard is that MIDI channel 10 is reserved for drum tones. Again, if I just go back to my sequencer page and scroll down, you can see all of these tracks passing. There's the trumpet, trombones. And if I get down to this one here, this is the track that I use for a click, and I also used it for the gong sound. And you can hear it's just gone straight to a drum set. So that's MIDI channel 10. If I carry on, this is MIDI channel number 11, which is the first violins. And then keep scrolling down, we've got second violins, some violas, and then finally some double basses down here. For the strings, I used all the same tone, a string ensemble tone, rather than using different ones. But I could have used different ones. Going back to Reason, so there's the rack that we've had a quick look at here with the MIDI out devices. Then also there's a mixer, which allows you to control each of the recorded information, the audio rather than the MIDI information, balance it and put effects on. So let's go back into the sequencer, and I'm going to show you the sort of process that I went through in creating the final recording. If we look on our sequencer page at the top here, flute number 1. This is the MIDI track for flute number 1. And I can play this tone. And I recorded little bits of information, little performances of each of the notes that I wanted on that MIDI track. Maybe I edited it a little bit of editing, and then finally I recorded it. So the track underneath, this track here, is actually a recording of the MIDI playing the notes. So I'm going to record some MIDI into this track. I'm going to turn the click on, press record. And then press stop, and then rewind back to the beginning and press play. I need to unmute it as well. Here we go. So that's the MIDI data that I've just recorded. Let's just make it a little bit bigger as well. And if I double click on it, you can see these are the notes that I actually played one at a time. And again, this will be similar in lots of other DAW programs where you can edit the MIDI data. So for each of these notes, I could change the pitch of the note. I could change the position, the timing of the note. So I could make it play at the same time as the note before, or I can even change the length of that note as well. And then there's also velocity. That's how hard I hit the notes. Did I hit them softly, or did I play them with more velocity? So that's the MIDI aspect of recording. Now, MIDI is not audio. It's just recording my gestures as I play the keys on the keyboard or move the pitch bend wheel. It records that information, and I could then decide, well, actually I don't want it on the flutes, I'll have it played by the clarinet. So if I just drag it down to a clarinet track, just going to solo this clarinet track, you'll now hear the same thing but played with the clarinet tone. Okay, so I hope that gives you an example there of what MIDI is actually doing. It's not recording audio, it's recording gestures. So what I want to do now is actually record the audio. So the way to do that is to set up an audio track. In Ableton, I think, I don't use that program, but if you do have that program, I think when you set up a MIDI device, it automatically sets up an audio track. But in Reason, I have to set up a separate audio track, which is what I've got here. And you can see my voice coming in and triggering these little green LEDs. But this is going to be the track that we're going to record this MIDI data as audio. I select the track and then I just press record. Then I press stop, and at the moment there's not a lot to see. I would have spent a little more time actually getting the levels. You want the levels to be a bit stronger than they were in that recording. Before I play it back, actually, I'm going to just normalize it. What normalize does is it expands the dynamic range of that clip, of that recording, so it utilizes the full dynamic range. So on Reason, that means I've got to press the right button and do that, normalize. And now let's have a listen to this track. And you can see the waveform here that's been generated during that recording process. We're not listening back to the MIDI. I've muted the MIDI track. We're only listening to the clarinet. Of course, I couldn't now then move that to another track and change the tone. We're fixed with this particular tone. But what it does enable you to do is now manipulate it and add effects and chop it up and do various editing functions that you couldn't do with the MIDI data. So if I go back to my song now, the final recording that we made, you can see, I hope, going right to the very top, unmute those. So I've muted the MIDI tracks. These ones with M's are all the MIDI tracks, and I created separate recordings, audio recordings of each part of the piece of music. There's quite a lot of them all the way through the whole song. Right to the bottom down here. And then what that allows me to do is actually apply some effects to those and balance them in terms of volume. And if you can see underneath this first flute part, for instance, there's a little bit of controller information that increases the volume. I wanted it to get louder, the flute tone to get louder at one point, so I created this crescendo and decrescendo, which is what we call it in music, just getting louder and getting softer. So maybe if I just play a little bit of that, you can hear. Let's go from a few bars before. The flute got a little bit louder at that point. And in fact, even if you didn't quite hear that on the video, if I show you on the mixer page, you'll see the fader for that flute move up very slightly. Here we go. And then it drops back down for another section which I wanted to be a bit quieter. So you can see how you can be much more creative once you've got those audio recordings, audio clips in there. You can really manipulate the sound. And one way of manipulating the sound even further is to apply some effects. And rather than use the reverb effects that are built into the keyboard, which are adequate enough for most situations, I added some reverb from the DAW. So again, if I just go back a short way and we play a little clip. So I've turned the reverb off here. So this is a dry sound of the flute. And let's have a listen to it with the reverb. So now there's a lot more space around that tone, and it sounds, like it's in a room. Other things that I did to edit and shape the music in the DAW, as well as the balance, was the panning of the sound, kind of position them in a stereo field. And the flutes at the beginning of this piece of music are basically playing exactly the same thing. So if I go and find that section, they're just playing two notes up, back and forth, like this. And then what I've done in the mix is to pan one to the left and one to the right, so that you get that sort of crossing over of the sound. And that's all been done in the mixer here. Just move up a little bit. There's a left and right pan control. Again, you've got some of that functionality within the keyboard. But there I've done it on, obviously in this recording. And that's pretty much it. So I hope that's sort of giving you maybe a bit more information about getting into using a DAW, setting it up with the keyboard. I still think for the money, you've got a very good set of basic sounds within the keyboard, but you can take them on to another level by using some software like this. So thanks for watching, and keep subscribing and tuning in, and I hope to bring you some more similar videos in the new year.